When we rented that house off campus, we were excited. It was an opportunity to escape the chaos of the dorms and have a place of our own. There were 4 of us in total: me, Mike, the practical and organized one; Sarah, always optimistic, the type who believed in good vibes; and Jake, who went through life on autopilot. The house was old, with wooden floors that creaked underfoot, and a creepy basement we decided to avoid right from the start. It wasn't a horror movie house, but it had character, you know? It seemed perfect for student life. During the first few weeks, we were too busy with classes and parties to notice anything strange. But over time, little things started happening, almost imperceptible. First, there was the smell of cigarette smoke. None of us smoked, but sometimes the smell lingered in the living room at night. I blamed the neighbor across the street, who was always out on his porch with a cigarette in hand. Then came the footprints in the backyard. Sarah noticed them. It had rained that day, and she saw boot prints in the dirt near the kitchen window. Nobody thought much of it. "It's probably the gardener or something," Mike said. Even so, Sarah started locking the window every night, just in case. The following week, it was Jake who noticed something weird. He was looking for a missing charger when he found an old mug in the basement, with dried coffee residue at the bottom. "I thought no one came down here," he said, holding the mug like it was an archaeological relic. We laughed it off, of course. Who'd want to hang out in the basement? But something about that mug bothered me. It was dirty, chipped, and definitely not ours. When I asked everyone, nobody knew where it had come from. Things got more serious when Mike found the crawl space. We were moving some boxes from under the stairs to make room for a Halloween party when he bumped his knee on something odd. It was a small, almost invisible hatch, as if it had been designed to go unnoticed. Curious, we decided to open it. Sarah was the first to crawl inside, holding her phone as a flashlight. "There's something here," she said hesitantly. When she came out, she was holding an old sleeping bag and a bag full of random items: a toothbrush, an empty wallet, and a crumpled photo of a woman none of us recognized. After we found those things in the crawl space, the atmosphere in the house changed. It was no longer just an old and slightly strange place. Now it felt like we had invaded someone else's space. Mike tried to rationalize it, as always. "It's probably just stuff left behind by the last tenant," he said, but none of us seemed convinced. Why would someone hide a bag with such personal items under the stairs? And how would that explain the cigarette smell or the footprints? Sarah suggested we should call the landlord, but Jake rolled his eyes. "And say what? That we found a sleeping bag? He's just going to laugh at us." In the end, we ignored it, or at least we tried to. That night, I woke up to a strange noise. It sounded like a scratching, coming from downstairs, repetitive and almost rhythmic. I lay there for a few seconds, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But the sound continued. I grabbed my phone and sent a message to the house group chat. "Is anyone else hearing this?" The response came almost instantly from Sarah. "Yes, sounds like it's coming from the living room." My heart raced. I opened my bedroom door slowly and peeked down the hallway. I saw Mike doing the same from the other side. We met in the middle of the hall, both with the same look of barely contained panic. We crept downstairs, trying not to make any noise. The living room was dark, except for a faint light coming from the kitchen. And that's when I saw it. A shadow. It wasn't a trick of the light or my imagination. There was someone standing in the living room, hunched over like they were messing with something. My body froze, and for a moment, I couldn't even breathe. Mike was the one who broke the silence, whispering, "Who's there?" The figure turned slowly, but before we could see their face, they bolted toward the kitchen. When we turned on the lights, there was no one there. The back door was unlocked and wide open, swaying in the wind. After that, none of us could sleep. Sarah was quietly crying on the couch, while Mike kept checking the locks compulsively. Jake, who always acted indifferent, was pale as a ghost. We decided to call the police. They came, asked a few questions, and searched the house. When we showed them the crawl space, one of the officers frowned. "You said you didn't touch anything down here?" he asked, pointing at the sleeping bag. We confirmed, but then he showed us something we hadn't noticed: a half-empty pack of cigarettes with the fresh smell of tobacco. "Looks like they were here today," he said, looking at us with a serious expression. After the police left, the silence in the house was almost unbearable. None of us knew what to do or say. We just sat in the living room for a while, as if waiting for someone to take responsibility for figuring it all out. Finally, Mike suggested we spend the night at a friend's place, but Sarah refused. "What if he comes back? What if he takes something?" she argued, her voice trembling. We ended up staying but agreed to lock ourselves in the same room. Fear had turned our house into a hostile territory, and every little sound felt amplified by the tension. In the middle of the night, the noise came back. This time it was closer, as if coming from inside the walls. I wanted to believe it was just the old plumbing, but the thought of someone moving around the house wouldn't leave my mind. No one dared to investigate. We stayed huddled together in the room, our eyes fixed on the door, while the sounds persisted. When morning came, we left the house together, locked it up, and went straight to the rental office. The clerk seemed uncomfortable as we explained the situation, but assured us the owner would send someone to check things out. Meanwhile, we decided to dig up more information about the house. We spent the day at the local library, combing through old records. Sarah was the first to find something: a newspaper article from about 5 years ago. A man had been arrested for breaking into houses in the area. He would hide in basements or attics, living there for weeks without being noticed. The most disturbing detail was the photo that accompanied the article. The man's gaunt face and hollow eyes looked eerily familiar. Sarah was convinced it was the same person who had been in our house. But how could we prove it? And worse, was he still around? When we returned to the house later that day, we found a note taped to the door, written in shaky handwriting. "You shouldn't have touched my things." My heart was pounding, and this time, none of us wanted to go inside. We called the police again, begging them to send someone immediately. While we waited in the car, I saw something in the basement window. I can't explain what it was, a shadow, a silhouette, but it was there, unmoving, watching us. When the officers arrived and searched the house again, they found nothing, but one of them had a grim look on his face. "You made the right call to leave," he said. "Some people don't like being disturbed." On our last night in the house, we were all exhausted and eager to get out. We decided to sleep in the same room again, with our bags packed and ready to leave at dawn. I couldn't stop thinking about the note. Whoever had written it knew where we were and had been close enough to leave that warning. Even with the doors locked and windows sealed, it was impossible to feel safe. The silence felt heavy, like the house itself was waiting for something. Despite our exhaustion, none of us could fall asleep. Around 3 a.m, the noise came back, but this time it was different. It was louder, more insistent, like hurried footsteps coming from the basement. Sarah started crying, and Mike, trembling, grabbed a baseball bat he had picked up at a yard sale a few days earlier. Out of either courage or desperation, we decided to go down and face whatever or whoever was there. We opened the basement door cautiously, and the darkness seemed to swallow us whole. When the flashlight beam hit the space, I saw something I'll never forget. The sleeping bag was empty, but now there were several candles scattered across the floor, all recently extinguished, with fresh wax drippings. Jake was the one who noticed the markings on the wall. Words scratched into the plaster. "You will never be alone." That was the breaking point. We ran out of the house and called the police one more time, begging them to come immediately. While we waited in the car, I kept looking at the basement window. There was something there, a shadow, a figure. I don't know, but it was standing still, watching us. When the officers arrived and searched the house thoroughly, they found nothing, but one of them gave us a chilling piece of advice. "Sometimes it's better to leave things alone," he said, his tone grave. The next morning, we handed the keys back to the rental office and moved into separate apartments closer to campus. We never went back to that house, and the landlord never gave us any explanation for what happened. To this day, I think about that shadow, the words on the wall, and the constant feeling of being watched. I know there's something, or someone, living on the edges of our reality, hiding in places like that. And every time I pass by an old house, I can't help but wonder, who's really living there? I was 17 at the time, and it was one of those last summer nights before we had to return to the dull routine of school. My friends, Jake, Emily, and Ryan, and I were bored, looking for something different to do. It was common for us to come up with stupid dares, things to prove how brave we were. That night, someone suggested the abandoned playground at the end of Pine Street, the kind of place your grandmother would tell you to avoid because it had bad energy. The playground had been closed for years, rusting in the middle of an overgrown lot. There were always creepy stories about it, but until then, they were just that, stories. To be honest, I never cared much about those legends. People said a kid disappeared there decades ago, and another died in a freak accident on the slide. But looking back, it made sense why no one went there anymore. The fence was broken, the walls covered in grotesque graffiti, and the place just felt wrong. But that night, those stories only fueled our curiosity. Emily, always the fearless one, challenged us. "What, are you scared? Let's check it out." Of course, none of us wanted to look like cowards. We crossed the street with cheap flashlights and phones in hand, laughing nervously. The main gate was locked with a rusty chain, but we could squeeze through a hole in the fence. As soon as we stepped inside, the sound of the city seemed to vanish. The place was quieter than it should have been, like even the wind avoided it. The old slide was still there, with its paint peeling off and rust creating weird patterns. The swings swayed gently, but the air was so still that it didn't seem possible it was the wind. Still, we pressed on, pretending to be more relaxed than we actually were. Ryan was the first to notice the marks. "Hey, did you guys see this?" he asked, pointing at the swing. There was a handprint in the dust covering the metal. It wasn't old, it was fresh. Emily, trying to keep the mood light, said, "Someone probably came by here yesterday." But even she looked unsettled. I took out my phone and snapped a picture. That simple act broke the tension, and we started laughing and teasing each other again. But deep down, I already felt like something wasn't right. There was no way someone had left those prints recently. The place was a forgotten hole, or so I thought. As we explored, I started noticing details that didn't make sense. There were scratches on the ground, like something heavy had been dragged around the rusty merry-go-round. Ryan commented that it looked like someone had been moving stuff there, but we brushed it off. Still, my heart was racing. The silence of the place was almost deafening, and time felt slower, like the playground existed in its own little bubble. Even with our nervous laughter, it was hard to ignore the feeling of being watched. That's when Emily got the first text message. She was a few steps ahead, shining her flashlight at a half-buried tunnel slide, when her phone buzzed. "That's weird. I don't know this number," she said, frowning as she opened the message. The text was short, direct, and unsettling. "You shouldn't be here." She showed it to us, and of course we thought it was a prank. Maybe some kid from school had followed us, or knew what we were up to. Jake laughed and said, "This has to be Ryan's doing." But judging by Ryan's confused face, it clearly wasn't. Things took a darker turn when we all started receiving similar texts, one after another. Each message seemed oddly specific, like whoever was sending them knew exactly where we were. Mine said, "Step away from the swing now." Instinctively, I glanced behind me and felt a cold knot in my stomach when I realized I was standing right next to the swing. I took a few steps back, trying to hide my unease. Emily tried to act tough, laughing loudly. "All right, whoever's messing with us, come out already." But there was no response. The only sound, aside from our voices, was the faint creak of the swing, which now seemed even more sinister. The tension peaked when Jake, ever the skeptic, decided to confront whoever it was. He typed out a message, something like, "Okay, funny. Who are you?" The moment he hit send, his phone died. Completely black, even though the battery had been full just minutes ago. We tried turning it back on, but nothing worked. When Ryan shone his flashlight on Jake's face, I could see the disbelief and fear settling in. His usual skepticism had vanished. "We need to leave now," he said, breaking the silence. But Emily, still stubborn, insisted, "Come on, this is just someone trying to scare us. Let's not give them the satisfaction." That's when we heard the first noise. It was a sharp, scraping sound, like metal being dragged, coming from the back of the playground. It seemed to be coming from the slide, but it was too dark to see anything clearly. We all froze and exchanged uneasy glances. The kind of silence that followed wasn't just fear, it was the unspoken acknowledgement that something was wrong. Ryan aimed his flashlight at the slide, and for a brief moment, I swear I saw something move. It wasn't big, but it was fast enough to make my heart skip a beat. "Probably just a rat or something," I muttered, trying to convince myself more than anyone else. Emily, still trying to act fearless, said, "This is ridiculous. I'm going to check it out." Before we could stop her, she started walking toward the slide, her flashlight trembling slightly in her hand. Ryan followed, muttering, "This is such a bad idea." Jake and I stayed back, frozen in place. That's when Emily's phone buzzed again, cutting through the silence like a knife. She stopped dead in her tracks and looked at the screen. When I asked her what it said, her voice came out low, almost a whisper. "You have 10 seconds to leave." Even Emily, with all her bravado, seemed shaken now. Her hand holding the flashlight was visibly shaking, and her breathing grew louder. "Okay, enough of this. Who's messing with us?" she shouted, but her voice seemed to be swallowed by the darkness. Suddenly, the swing began to move on its own. At first, it swayed gently, but then it picked up speed as if an invisible child were playing on it. There was no wind, and we all knew it. That was the moment we instinctively stepped back, even Emily. Then we realized we weren't alone. Deep in the tunnel slide, there was something. Looking closer, I noticed a faint reflection inside the tunnel. 2 glowing points, like eyes catching the light from the flashlight. But what froze me was the pale, thin hand that appeared, gripping the edge of the tunnel. It was oversized, with long, spindly fingers that scratched against the worn plastic. Jake snapped us out of it, yelling, "Run!" And we ran. We didn't look back. We just scrambled through the hole in the fence as fast as we could. My chest burned, my legs felt like they were giving out, but all I could think about was getting as far away from that place as possible. When we finally made it to the sidewalk outside the playground, we collapsed onto the ground, trying to catch our breath. Nobody said anything for a few seconds. All we could hear was our heavy breathing. Emily was the first to break the silence. "Did you guys see that? There's no way that was human." Nobody answered right away, but the look on everyone's faces made it clear we had all seen the same thing. Ryan glanced back toward the hole in the fence, as if expecting something, or someone, to follow us. "We need to leave now, like right now." That's when all our phones started vibrating at the same time. The messages came in rapid succession, one after another, like someone was furiously typing them. I pulled out my phone with trembling hands and read the first message. "You shouldn't have left." Another one said, "It's too late now." I looked around, and everyone was just as terrified as I was. Emily threw her phone to the ground, swearing, and Jake, who was usually the most rational of us, started pleading for us to leave. He didn't need to ask twice. We rushed back to our homes, and that night was a complete nightmare. None of us could sleep, and the messages kept coming. Each one was more threatening than the last. Turning off our phones didn't help. They would turn back on by themselves, buzzing non-stop. When Ryan finally answered one of the calls, the only thing he heard on the other end was heavy breathing, almost like a growl. After that, he threw his phone in the trash and swore never to talk about that night again. Slowly, we all did the same. Changed our numbers, erased any trace of that night, and tried to move on. Years later, I still think about that playground. I looked into it after some time, but I never found anything about the messages or who could have sent them. The place was torn down not long after, and now it's just a parking lot. Still, I sometimes dream about that swing, the tunnel, and those glowing eyes. And every time I remember that night, I get a chill that never really goes away. Maybe we were lucky to get out of there, or maybe we only delayed the inevitable. I haven't received any texts like those since, but I always get uneasy when my phone buzzes in the middle of the night. I work as a cashier at a 24-hour diner, the kind that never closes, and my schedule has always been pretty odd. Back then, I was 23 years old and used to work the night shift from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. The worst part was the walk to the bus stop, which was on a poorly lit street with those yellow streetlights that flicker more than they illuminate. It wasn't a long walk, but the oppressive silence of the sleeping city always got to me. Usually, I'd put on my headphones and wait for the bus like a statue, avoiding eye contact with the rare passers-by. It was a Tuesday, and I was particularly exhausted. The night had been chaos, drunk customers, messed up orders, and a coffee machine that decided to break down. When I got to the bus stop, it was empty, as usual. The clock read 6:12 a.m., and my bus wasn't due until 6:25. So, I leaned against the post, scrolling through my phone to kill time. That's when I noticed a man walking down the sidewalk. He was tall, wearing a worn gray jacket, and moved slowly, like he wasn't in any rush. I saw him, of course, but I tried to ignore him. He stopped near the bus stop, but not too close, which made me relax a little. After a few seconds, he started a conversation. "Do you work around here?" he asked with a smile. His voice was rough, but not aggressive. Without looking up from my phone, I replied with a short, "Yeah." It wasn't unusual for someone to make small talk, but something about his posture made me uneasy. He didn't seem bored. He seemed too curious. "Do you always catch this bus at this time?" he continued, tilting his head as if trying to appear friendly. I shrugged and muttered, "Depends," hoping he'd drop it. But he didn't. In fact, he started watching me in a way that sent chills down my spine. There was something calculated about his gaze, like he was assessing every move I made. I began to feel trapped, like prey being studied by a predator. I tried to stay calm, but every question he asked felt more invasive than the last. "Do you live near here?" he asked, with that smile that didn't reach his eyes. I froze for a second before lying. "No, I'm just passing through." He chuckled, a short and strange laugh, like he knew I wasn't telling the truth. That made me even more uncomfortable. What did he want? My mind started racing, trying to calculate the distance back to the diner. If I ran, would he follow me? He took a step closer, still keeping that casual tone. "You know, I used to work around here too. But these hours are dangerous, aren't they? You never know who might be around." The way he said it made my stomach drop. It wasn't just the words, but the almost amused tone he used, like he was testing how I'd react. I glanced around, hoping to see someone, anyone, but the street was empty. The only sound was the low hum of the street lamp. My hands were sweating, and I forced myself to sound calm, even though my heart was racing. "Yeah, that's true. That's why I'm always careful," I replied, trying to sound firm. He laughed again, but this time it was colder. "Being careful is never enough," he muttered, almost to himself. The clock on the bus stop read 6:22. My bus was supposed to arrive in 3 minutes. I clung to that thought like a lifeline, but then I noticed something strange. He was looking at the clock too. Not in a distracted way, but intently, almost eagerly. That's when it hit me. He knew when my bus would arrive, and he probably knew I'd have to walk home alone afterward. My heart was pounding, but I knew that showing fear might make things worse. I tried shifting my position, pretending to adjust my backpack to create some space between us. "Are you waiting for a bus too?" I asked, trying to sound casual, even though the tension was crushing me inside. He slowly shook his head with a smile that was as unsettling as it was forced. "No, just out for a walk. I like mornings. They're so peaceful, you know?" That sounded like a lie. Who in their right mind takes a stroll on that street at 6 in the morning? The clock ticked to 6:24, and I saw the bus lights in the distance. My breathing eased slightly, but a new fear crept in. What would he do when I got on the bus? Was he just trying to scare me, or was this something much worse? I needed a plan. As the bus approached, an idea struck me. I grabbed my phone and pretended to text someone. In reality, I opened my notes app and typed, "Man following me at the bus stop. Tall gray jacket. If something happens, it's him." I slid my phone back into my pocket and took a deep breath, trying to appear calm. The bus pulled up, and I climbed on quickly, handing my fare to the driver with trembling hands. I glanced back, and just as I feared, the man got on too. He didn't hesitate for a second. My stomach churned. I sat down near the middle of the bus, close to a few other passengers, while he took a seat further back, but still with a clear view of me. The sensation of being hunted returned with full force. I racked my brain for a solution. Getting off at my usual stop wasn't an option. He could easily follow me. Then I noticed the driver in the rearview mirror. He was an older man, with a stern face and sharp eyes that seemed experienced. That gave me hope. I stood up slowly and walked to him, pretending to ask a question. "Excuse me, can you stop near the police station? Someone's following me," I whispered, my voice shaking. The driver looked at me for a moment, as if assessing whether I was serious, then gave a small nod. The bus continued down the road, and I noticed the driver keeping a close eye on the situation through the rearview mirror. Meanwhile, I forced myself not to look back, but I could still feel his eyes burning into me like an invisible weight. The other passengers were completely unaware, absorbed in their own lives. The idea of asking someone else for help crossed my mind, but the fear that he might react unpredictably kept me frozen. As we approached the police station, the driver did something unexpected. He turned on the interior lights of the bus, making it brighter inside, as if it were just a routine adjustment. But I realized it was a signal, a subtle way to draw attention to the situation. He slowed the bus down and stopped right in front of the police station entrance. I glanced at him, and he gave me a slight nod, silently telling me this was my chance. My heart pounded, but I knew I had to act quickly. I got up, trying to stay composed, and stepped off the bus without looking back. The moment my feet hit the pavement, I heard footsteps behind me. He had gotten off too. Panic surged through me, but instead of running, I walked directly toward the police station entrance, forcing myself to appear confident. Once I crossed the threshold, I turned around and saw him standing outside, wearing that same unnerving smile. He seemed to hesitate, as if weighing his options. Inside, a police officer at the reception desk noticed my distressed state. I could barely speak, but I pointed at the man outside and said, "He's been following me since the bus stop." The officer immediately stepped outside with another officer, but by the time they got there, the man had already disappeared around the corner. After I explained everything, including his invasive questions and the moment he got on the bus, they assured me they would patrol the area, but admitted it was unlikely they'd catch him. I never saw him again, but from that day on, I completely changed my routine. I started taking taxis, no matter the cost, and I never walked alone at night again. Even now, I still remember his gaze and the feeling of being hunted. It haunts me in my worst nightmares. I used to work as a barista in a cozy little coffee shop on the outskirts of a small town. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other and the regulars had familiar faces. My shift usually started at 6 in the morning, so I spent most of my day serving cappuccinos and listening to casual conversations. Back then, my life was quiet and predictable. But that changed when I started paying attention to one specific customer. He was an older man, probably in his 50s, with an unshaven face and clothes that looked like they hadn't seen a washing machine in years. We called him Jack, because that was the name he always gave when placing his order, but no one knew if it was his real name. Jack was a mystery. He'd come into the coffee shop at least 4 times a week, always ordering a simple black coffee and sitting in the furthest corner. He never bothered anyone, but I noticed how his gaze lingered on everything around him. His eyes were heavy, like they carried more stories than he wanted to share. He always brought a battered backpack, clutching it tightly as if it held something valuable. The most curious thing, though, was his routine. He'd show up religiously for weeks, then suddenly vanish without a trace. When he came back, he looked more worn out, but never offered an explanation. Things took a strange turn about 3 months ago. One day, Jack showed up looking unusually clean-shaven, and I swear he smelled like expensive cologne. I didn't comment, but something about him felt out of place. The following week, he disappeared again, and I didn't see him until I was in a neighboring city for my sister's medical appointment. That's when I spotted Jack across the street. But he wasn't the Jack I knew. He was dressed in a sharp suit, polished shoes, and carrying a leather briefcase. He was talking to a group of people who looked important, lawyers or businessmen maybe. I froze and watched, trying to make sense of it, but nothing added up. When he noticed me, he froze for a second. His eyes were the same, but this time there was something more, like he was calculating whether I posed a threat. After a few moments, he turned away, got into a sleek black car with tinted windows, and disappeared. The car didn't have visible plates, and it sent a chill down my spine. Back at the coffee shop, I spent days replaying the scene in my head, wondering who Jack really was. That moment marked the start of my obsession with figuring him out. Something told me this was just the tip of the iceberg. After seeing him like that, something inside me shifted. I couldn't look at Jack the same way anymore. He wasn't just the mysterious man in the corner. I started observing him more closely every time he came into the shop, like I was trying to solve a puzzle. The thing that intrigued me the most was his backpack. He never let anyone get close to it, not even when he went to the bathroom. He always took it with him. One day, while cleaning the tables after he finished his usual black coffee, I noticed he had dropped a piece of paper on the floor. It was a receipt from a store in a faraway city, dated during one of the weeks he had vanished. The store's name? Something called Le Grand Antiquities. That grabbed my attention. That night, I looked up the store on my phone. It wasn't just any antique shop. Le Grand Antiquities was known for dealing in rare and sometimes questionable items. In some obscure forums, people even speculated it was a front for illegal trades. My imagination started running wild. What would Jack, a man who looked like he had no place to call home, be doing in a place like that? The question gnawed at me for days. I even thought about asking him directly, but the look he had given me when we locked eyes in that other city still made me uneasy. It felt like a silent warning to stay out of his business. The following weeks were like a waiting game. Jack returned to the coffee shop as if nothing had happened, but I couldn't act normal around him anymore. The tension was almost unbearable. I started noticing little things I had never paid attention to before. His shoes, though worn, were from an expensive brand. His nails were always clean, odd for someone who seemed homeless. Then one day, as he was rummaging through his backpack, I caught a glimpse of what looked like a thick wad of cash. It wasn't just a few bills. It was a stack, tightly held together with a rubber band. I tried to pretend I hadn't noticed, but I think he caught the expression on my face. He quickly zipped up the bag and left without finishing his coffee. That's when things spiraled out of control. One evening, as I was closing the coffee shop alone, I had the unsettling feeling that I was being watched. I looked outside and saw a shadowy figure standing under a streetlight in the distance. My heart pounded in my chest, and the first person who came to mind was Jack. I rushed to lock the door, trying to shake off the eerie feeling that something was very wrong. When I finally finished cleaning up and stepped outside, the figure was gone, but the uneasiness lingered. I knew it wasn't a coincidence. Jack must have realized I was piecing things together, and now it felt like he was keeping an eye on me. After that night, I started questioning if I had gotten myself into something bigger than I could handle. For days, I kept looking over my shoulder, waiting for that shadowy figure to reappear. When Jack returned to the coffee shop, the tension was almost unbearable. He seemed quieter than usual, but that day, he did something different. He left a note under his coffee cup before walking out. My hands were shaking as I picked it up. On the paper, written in elegant and precise handwriting, were the words, "Some questions shouldn't be asked." My stomach dropped. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a warning. As frightening as it was, that note didn't make me stop. If anything, it made me even more determined to find out the truth. I went back to researching everything I could about Legrand antiquities and anything that might connect to Jack. The deeper I dug, the stranger things became. I found out that the store had been under federal investigation years ago, but the case was dropped due to lack of evidence. I also came across mentions of a supposed group that used the shop as a front to launder money and smuggle artifacts. The pieces were starting to fit together. Jack might be a courier, someone who operated under the radar but had connections to high-profile operations. What confirmed my suspicions happened about a week later. I was leaving the grocery store when I noticed two men sitting in a black car parked near the coffee shop. They didn't look like locals. That much was obvious. They wore suits similar to the one I had seen Jack wearing in the other city, and one of them was holding a photo. I didn't need to get closer to know what it was. It was a photo of me. My whole body went into survival mode. Without thinking, I pulled out my phone and snapped a picture of their car before running straight home. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat on my couch, staring at the door, waiting for something to happen. But no one came. The next morning, I knew I had to act. I gathered everything I had, my notes on Jack, the warning note, and the picture of the car, and went straight to the local police station. I explained everything to the officer on duty, but he looked at me like I was crazy. Even so, he agreed to take the evidence for review. After that, Jack never came back to the coffee shop. The men in the black car vanished as well. But I never really returned to my old routine. To this day, I don't know exactly what Jack was involved in, or why he chose my coffee shop to hide in plain sight. But one thing is certain, he was part of something far bigger, and I had only scratched the surface. I rented a small apartment in an old building downtown, the kind of place that had seen better days. It was simple, with a narrow, dimly lit hallway that always smelled of something I couldn't quite place, a mix of old dust and burnt food. I'd been living there for about 6 months after a messy breakup. Life was in a phase where I just wanted peace and to reconnect with myself. Despite the building being old and a bit run down, the rent was affordable, and my neighbors kept to themselves. But it was on a cold night in March that things started to change. I was lying on the couch, watching some random show to distract myself, when I heard it for the first time. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it seemed to come from the hallway, right outside my apartment door. I thought it might be a neighbor, but when I opened the door, no one was there. The hallway was empty, except for the maintenance closet with its rusty padlock. The sound was coming from inside. It was muffled, like something or someone was moving in there. I stood staring at the closet for a few seconds, my heart racing, but eventually I closed the door and convinced myself it was just the wind, or maybe an old pipe creaking. The next morning, I mentioned the sound to Mark, the building's landlord, while he was changing a hallway light bulb. He was a man in his 60s with a thin mustache and a constant smell of tobacco. When I asked about the closet, he shrugged and said it was just for tools and building supplies. When I pressed him about the noise, he laughed as if I were crazy. "It's an old building, ma'am. Doors creak, pipes make noise. That's just how it is. Don't worry about it." It wasn't the answer I wanted, but I let it go. After all, he seemed certain it was nothing. But the next night, the sound came back. This time it was clearer, almost like muffled crying or short whimpers, and it was more persistent. I went to the door again and looked through the peephole. The hallway was deserted, dimly lit by a flickering light bulb. I thought about opening the door, but something made me hesitate. I stood there for a few minutes, listening, trying to make sense of what was happening. It wasn't my imagination. Something was inside that locked closet, and it seemed like it was trying to get out. The next morning, the sound was still fresh in my mind. I tried to ignore it and go about my routine, but something kept gnawing at me. When I went down to throw out the trash in the communal dumpster outside, I saw the first strange thing. Among torn garbage bags and leftover food, there was a blood-stained rag. I froze for a moment, but tried to rationalize it. It could be paint, tomato sauce, anything, I thought. I grabbed a stick from the ground and flipped the fabric over. There was no smell, but it definitely looked like blood. What disturbed me most was how it was folded almost neatly, like someone had placed it there on purpose. The next day, I found something else bizarre. I was coming home from work when I tripped over a toy in the middle of the hallway, right in front of the locked closet. It was a teddy bear, but it was filthy, with one eye ripped out and the stitching on its back torn open, as if someone had tried to pull it apart. There were no kids in the building, so where had it come from? I picked it up carefully and threw it in the trash, but the feeling that something was off kept growing. More and more, that closet felt like the center of everything. I decided to talk to my neighbors to see if anyone else had noticed anything strange, but most of them weren't home. Those who were seemed reluctant to speak to me. Sarah, from apartment 302, just shook her head and said she didn't hear anything because she turned her hearing aid off at night. A guy from 202, who always seemed to be in a rush, mumbled something about noises being common in the building and disappeared down the stairs before I could ask more. My last attempt was with Mark again, but he just laughed when I mentioned the teddy bear. People throw all kinds of things away, you know? You've been watching too many horror movies, miss. On the third night, the sound in the closet changed. It wasn't just muffled cries or whispers anymore. It sounded like rhythmic scratching, like nails scraping against the wood from the inside. I grabbed my phone and recorded the sound, if only to prove to myself I wasn't losing my mind. The audio was clear, scratching, and occasionally what sounded like heavy breathing. I sent it to my friend Emily, who loved mysterious and creepy stories. Her reply came quickly. "This is so wrong. Have you thought about calling the police?" Emily insisted I call the police, but I hesitated. How could I explain it? "Hi, I'm hearing strange noises coming from a maintenance closet." They'd probably think I was crazy, just like Mark did. But Emily's pressure made me decide to investigate a bit more on my own. The next morning, I left a note taped to the closet door. "Why are you making those noises? Do you need help?" It felt childish, maybe even ridiculous, but I didn't know what else to do. When I came back that afternoon, the note was gone. That night, I was lying in bed, trying to distract myself with a podcast, but the sound came back. This time, it was louder and more insistent, almost like something was trying to break free. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a screwdriver and headed into the hallway. The padlock looked old and rusty, and after a few clumsy attempts, I managed to break it. My heart was pounding, and the adrenaline was almost unbearable. I opened the door slowly, expecting to find something. But the closet was empty, except for a strange smell, like rotting meat mixed with mildew. I scanned the small space with my phone's flashlight and saw something in the corner, almost hidden. It was a black leather wallet, dirty and worn. I picked it up carefully and opened it. Inside were an ID card and some credit cards. When I saw the owner's photo, my stomach turned. It was a man I recognized. His face had been on missing person posters plastered all over the city for weeks. Suddenly, the silence of the empty closet felt scarier than any noise I had heard before. I took the wallet back to my apartment, my hands shaking. I sat at the kitchen table and started going through the documents. There was nothing that explained how it had ended up there, but the feeling of being watched was almost unbearable. That's when I heard a loud noise in the hallway, like something heavy had fallen. I ran to the door and looked through the peephole. Once again, the hallway was empty, but the closet door was now wide open.